Our two novelists, Angie Kim and Eugenia Kim, both have local roots and have in common the Korean immigrant family experience, which is an integral and central element of their writing and storytelling. Raised in the suburbs of Baltimore, Angie went to Stanford University and then Harvard Law School, where she also was an editor of the Harvard Law Review, and then she practiced law for a time and has been and practiced as a trial lawyer. She's been recognized as an essayist for some time, with her writing appearing in the New York Times, Salon, Slate, the Southern Review, Sycamore Review, the Asian American Literary Review. She's going to discuss her first novel, very well received to this point, Miracle Creek. It's a captivating read, more than a courtroom suspense drama. It has multiple threads and perspectives. For me, it was kind of like a Rashomon kind of storytelling. And I'm very happy to welcome Eugenia Kim back to the Gaithersburg Book Festival. 10 years ago, on these grounds, I introduced Eugenia Kim when she talked about her first book, The Calligrapher's Daughter. It was an award-winning book. And you can still get a copy in the book tent. And I'm delighted she's returned to discuss her second novel, The Kinships of Secrets. It's a story of family separation, sisters, and the impact of secrets kept and revealed. Eugenia is the daughter of Korean immigrant parents who arrived in America shortly after World War II, and she was raised in Tacoma Park, Maryland. After a career in graphic design, she received her MFA in writing and literature from Bennington College, and now she teaches fiction at Fairfield University's MFA Creative Writing Program. And then our moderator, Susan Call, is a friend of the Gaithersburg Book Festival. I think you were here at the first one as well. Her most recent novel is a book called The Stager, sort of about selling a house, Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, NPR.org, theatlantic.com, and a variety of other publications. A Washington Post profile from a few years ago described her as a satirist skewering modern suburban life in general and affluent Bethesda in particular. Okay. That sounds like pretty good reading. I think I may have to start reading all of those. So Susan worked as an events and program director at Politics and Prose Bookstore and is currently a teaching at the Writers Center locally. So please join me in welcoming our two authors, Angie and Eugenia, and our moderator, Susan.
Well, thank you, Mike, for that great introduction, and I'm delighted to be back at this great festival. I've not been here every year as Mike has, but I've been here 9 out of the 10, so I'm really glad to be back. Also to have had the opportunity to read these two great novels. And before we begin talking about them, I thought it would be good if you could get a taste of both of their voices and a feel for the novel. So we're going to start with 2 readings, and then we might do more toward the end of the event. So, Eugenia, do you want to begin?
Doesn't matter. Yeah. So the novel takes place, it begins at the dawn of the Korean War, 1950 June in Seoul, Korea. The story is about 2 sisters who are separated. One lives in America with her parents, and the other one lives in Seoul with uncle, a very stern aunt, and grandparents. So as soon as the war began, they fled Seoul, and for a couple of days were on the road until they ended up at a refugee camp. And at this refugee camp, there's a giant warehouse, but there's no room in the warehouse, so they make camp outside on the grounds. And the daughter's name is Inja. She's 4 years old. She's a precocious 4-year-old. And her sneakers have been stolen, so they're alert to thievery in the camp. One thing about the grandmother, she had had a stroke the previous summer, so from America, the mother had sent a bedpan, a metal bedpan, which they think is like the paragon of American ingenuity. Okay. Inja's eyes open to a bright morning, someone shaking her shoulder. Aunt hissed, "Where's the bedpan?" Inja waved toward the cart. "It's not there. Grandmother needs it. Go find it." She swept off Inja's quilt. Inja hugged her elbows and looked around. Everything shone from the rain, and though the ground was wet, the mats had kept them dry. Grandfather sipped hot water, the lines on his face carved deep, his eyes hooded, and he crouched in that particular way that meant his back was hurting him. The cart was upended. I put it against that wheel, Inja said to Aunt. Aigu, someone stole it, she said. You should have hidden it. Where's Uncle? Perhaps Uncle had moved it when he turned the cart. He's gone back to get the servants and to find us an inn. So much had happened that it didn't surprise Inja to learn that he would help to get Cook and her daughter out of Seoul, where now there was war. Inja wanted Cook and her daughter, but she wanted Uncle back too. She shut her eyes and said a prayer, and Aunt flapped the quilts and yelled at her to find out who stole the bedpan. Inja tugged on dry socks and her rubber shoes, her face sour. Aunt shoved her hips and said, Do as you're told. What kind of child acts like that? It's no wonder your mother left you behind. Her usual rant and one impossible to ignore. She plowed through the bundles piled beneath the undertuned cart, resentful and certain that Aunt wouldn't have said that if Uncle were around. She skirted people's camps and sloshed through puddles. Fat raindrops from the trees splashed her neck as she looked for a gleaming white enamel or the blue of her rubber shoes. She tripped on a root and pain surged through her toe. She seethed at her shoes, that thief of a girl, and swore to stray all day to avoid Aunt, though her stomach rumbled. After she used the latrine, she dawdled at the warehouse's cavernous opening, addled enough by anger to want to beat up that bad-breathed girl who stole her shoes. Then, far beyond the pump, she glimpsed a familiar white oblong, and she strode toward it with purpose. There was the bedpan, balanced on stones over a small fire, a woman stirring something in it. Inja neared and smelled onions and soy sauce in its smoke. She ran back to Aunt. I found it. Come and see. Aunt followed her, fingers curled like a hawk's talons. But when she saw the woman cooking with the bedpan, she stopped and clutched Inja's shoulder. Hush, let's go back. At their camp, Grandmother fanned embers beneath the old iron cookpot, boiling water. In the other pot, fresh barley rice had been shaped into balls. Aunt told her about the bedpan. That poor woman didn't know better. We can't say anything now. Grandmother agreed they'd make do without it. Then they snickered, heads lowered. She'll wonder why her soup tastes so delicious, said Aunt. Wait until Cook hears about that special seasoning, said Grandmother. And they laughed aloud, mouths covered in modesty. In this desperate place where strangers stole things, certain manners such as saving face, even for strangers and thieves, still mattered. Inja had wearable shoes, and the family had 2 cookpots. They could forego a prized bedpan and a coveted pair of sneakers.
Hi, I'm Angie Kim. No relation. It's,
Although
the Kim.
I wish we were.
I know. It would be really nice. So first of all, thank you so much for coming on this hot day. I love this festival. I love festivals in general, although I've only been an author for a month because this book came out a month ago. But still, I've learned that in that short time that I really do love festivals. So thank you for having me, and thank you for being in conversation with me. Okay, so Miracle Creek, it's my debut novel, and I'll just give you a quick little rundown of an overview and then do a short reading from the very beginning of the novel. Miracle Creek is a literary courtroom drama about a Korean immigrant family and a young single mother who's on trial for murdering her 8-year-old son, who's on the autism spectrum. And Miracle Creek is a fictional town in rural Virginia where the Yu family, which is a Korean immigrant family, resides. And they run a business called the Miracle Submarine. The Miracle Submarine is not a real submarine, but it's a submarine-shaped chamber it's a real thing. And it's used in hospitals for things like burns and carbon monoxide poisoning and gangrene treatments and things like that. And then it's also become an experimental treatment that's been used as of late for things like autism, cerebral palsy, Lyme disease, and infertility. And in the novel, one day, there are 4 patients sealed inside with some caregivers, and somebody deliberately sets a fire by the oxygen tank outside. So there's an explosion, fire, people are dead, and we fast forward a year to the 4 days of the trial, which is how the novel is structured. And so in one sense, the novel is a who, how, and why done it. Who did this, how, and why. And I hope that it's a murder mystery and a courtroom thriller that, will have you reading pretty fast. But on the other hand, I really hope that it's a deep dive, and it's almost an excuse to take a deep dive into the lives of these families, the Korean immigrants who are very isolated in rural America especially, and needing this connection and desperate for it. And then also at the same time, this community of mothers and parents of children who are chronically ill and who are disabled, who also feel this need for connection and have suffered so much from needing to sacrifice so much of their lives. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. And then I'll do a quick reading from the very beginning of the novel, which serves as sort of a prologue of sorts. It's called The Incident. Miracle Creek, Virginia, Tuesday, August 26, 2008. My husband asked me to lie. Not a big lie. He probably didn't even consider it a lie, and neither did I at first. It was such a small thing, what he wanted. The police had just released the protesters, and while he stepped out to make sure they weren't coming back, I was to sit in his chair. Cover for him, the way coworkers do as a matter of course, the way we ourselves used to at the grocery store, while I ate or he smoked. But as I took his seat, I bumped against the desk, and the certificate above it went slightly crooked, as if to remind me that this wasn't a regular business, that there was a reason he'd never left me in charge before. Pak reached over me to straighten the frame, his eyes on the English lettering. Pak Yu, Miracle Submarine, LLC, Certified Hyperbaric Technician. He said, eyes still on the certificate, as if talking to it, not to me, everything's done. The patients are sealed in, the oxygen's on. You just have to sit here. He looked at me. That's it. I looked over the controls, the unfamiliar knobs and switches for the chamber we'd painted baby blue and placed in this barn just last month. What if the patients buzz me? I said. I'll say you'll be right back, but no, they can't know I'm gone. If anyone asks, I'm here. I've been here the whole time. But if something goes wrong, and what could go wrong? Pak said, his voice forceful like a command. I'll be right back, and they won't buzz you. Nothing will happen. He walked away, as if that was the end of the matter. But at the doorway, he looked back at me. Nothing will happen, he said again, softer. It sounded like a plea. As soon as the barn door banged shut, I wanted to scream that he was crazy to expect nothing to go wrong on this day, of all days, when so much had gone wrong. The protesters, the sabotage plan, the resulting power outage, the police. Did he think so much had already happened that nothing more could? But life doesn't work like that. Tragedies don't inoculate you against further tragedies, and misfortune doesn't get sprinkled out in fair proportions. Bad things get hurled at you in clumps and batches, unmanageable and messy. How could he not know that after everything we'd been through?
Well, those are both such great openings. I know Eugenia's is not strictly from the opening, but they both really set up these harrowing situations. And with your book, Eugenia, you've got this family forced to make a lot of difficult decisions, but one of them is whether to stay or go in the face of history, in the face of war. And I wonder how you went about researching and whether you kind of grew up with these stories.
So I definitely grew up with the stories, but the research was something that had to start from scratch. So even though I'm Korean American, I knew very little about my country of origin. So I began researching for the first novel, and then that process blended over into the second segment of history, which is the Korean War. So there was so much written about the Korean War in the American perspective, and so mostly it was militarily focused. So I was desperate for something that was written from the Korean perspective. Since I don't read Korean and don't speak it very well, that was much more difficult to find. But I did find two sources. One of them was a memoir by a boy soldier who had actually spent his time during the Korean War. And the other one was a military history of the Korean War by a Korean Institute of Military. So, and that one was a day-by-day account of what happened in the war, including what was on the radio. So that was a really essential resource for me, because not only did I learn what was happening almost hour to hour, especially in the beginning of the war, but also how the populace learned about, or what they didn't learn about, from how restricted the press was. So those two sources were major for me. And then I was able to create a timeline of the war and laid my story against it as a way to ensure that everything that was happening to them had its basis in history as well.
And Angie, although your books are very different, they're really also very similar in that they both touch on these family secrets and the immigrant experience, but also the specificity of the settings. And I feel like I learned so much from both of your books. And Angie, I knew nothing about this world of HBOT. Is that how? Yeah. Can you tell us how much you knew and how you went about learning about this?
Yeah. So it's funny. They say that, you put a lot of yourself into your first books. And definitely that's the case for me here. I feel like Miracle Creek is sort of like this mixing of 3 different strands of my life that have come together that I've hopefully been able to braid into a whole narrative. And so there was really not that much research because I had sort of lived it. So the 3 strands that I sort of brought together are, number 1, this Korean American immigrant experience. So I came over from Seoul to the outskirts of Baltimore as an 11-year-old. And the Korean family here, which is a teenage daughter who's sort of bratty and obnoxious and awful, is me, essentially lifted straight from me, and my parents, who unfortunately had to deal with me. And then the second strand is the courtroom drama element. So this is a murder trial, and I was a trial lawyer. And my favorite part of being a lawyer by far was being in the courtroom and doing things like, objecting and trying to trap witnesses into saying things that were inconsistent with something that I knew I had proof, of, so I could trap them and discredit them and things like that. So I loved stuff like that. And unfortunately, that element of being a trial lawyer is like 5% of being a lawyer. So I hated all the other elements, very sadly. So I left, but that really made for a very fun way to go back into the courtroom, or at least pretend that I was, by writing these courtroom scenes. And the only difference being that I could actually sort of like act as a puppet master and have these witnesses say exactly what I wanted them to say, which was amazing. So that was fun. And then the third strand is this world of the hyperbaric oxygen therapy, HBOT. I did that with one of my kids. So I have 3 boys, ranging from 10 to 17. And one of my boys was born deaf in one ear and also had ulcerative colitis and celiac disease. And for the ulcerative colitis especially, it was really hard to manage. And he was like throwing up every day and not gaining weight, and he was 4 years old. And when something like that happens and none of the standard treatments are working, I think you've become desperate as a parent to do things like even research experimental treatments, which I had never even believed in before, And so one of my friends was bringing this HBOT group chamber to our neighborhood on Route 7 in Reston, like Vienna area. And she said she was bringing it for a child, one of her kids who has autism, as an experimental therapy, and would I be interested in trying? And sent me some papers, research papers, talking about the effects of HBOT on ulcerative colitis. So I sort of grabbed onto it, and we thought, you know what, let's try it, because we were just so desperate, even though it sounded crazy. And so for a whole summer, we went into this thing that when my son first saw it, he like pointed to it. He was 4, and he was like, "That's a submarine," because it looks like a little mini submarine, just like the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, which we had just watched for family movie night, except that our submarine was blue, so we called it the Blue Submarine. And so we went in there with 3 other families, day after day, and for these hour-long sessions, and we, had nothing to do but talk to each other and compare our lives. Because of the risk of oxygen, we couldn't bring anything inside. And we really became this very intimate group, and we started sharing so much with each other, stuff that maybe are shameful thoughts that parents have, that you are ashamed to actually admit having thought, and it was years later, and I wasn't a writer at this point, but years later when I started writing and I wanted to write a novel, I thought, this is the setting that I want to use, because this is like this intimate, raw, intense atmosphere. It was like a crucible in a physical way and an emotional way. And so I decided to base it here. And I didn't really have to do that much research, which was amazing to me, anyway.
Lucky dog.
Yeah.
And Eugenia, often when I'm talking to authors, I know you're not allowed to ask, is this autobiographical? But in your case, you've given me permission, both of you have, and I know you also drew from some of your own family story. Can you talk about that a little? I'm not sure we've actually told everyone the setup of the sisters.
So when the parents, so this is based on family story. My parents left in 1948 to come to the U.S., but they only wanted to come for a couple of years and then go back. They were all living with my grandparents at the time. And my grandmother was so upset that they were leaving, believing that they would never come back once they had tasted the golden waters of America. So they had 3 children at the time. In the novel, it's just 2. And so they decided to leave one child behind, sort of as a guarantee that they would definitely be coming back. And they came to the U.S. in 48, and 2 years later, when they were still trying to raise money to go back home, the Korean War broke out. And so for another 10 years, they didn't see their daughter. And she grew up during wartime. The refugee camp is real. The bedpan is a real story. So on the one hand, it was easy to be able to tell this story because I knew these stories and I had interviewed my sister extensively. But on the other hand, in order to write a novel, you have to make a story that's compelling and that has a narrative arc, that has a plot. And so I found myself cutting quite a lot in order to create a story that would be cohesive and that would read like a novel. So what was interesting was I asked her to read it to make sure that she was okay, because I wanted to honor her story and I wanted to honor especially the difficulty that she had lived through. And so she read it, and I warned her because her separation from her uncle was very traumatic for her. I asked her, you may find some of this to be difficult. I'm afraid that you might cry. And so she says, let me just read it. And so she read it. She called me back that night, and she said, I read it, the whole thing. I didn't cry one bit. And I was like, dang, But then she called me back the next day, and she said she had cried the whole day that day. Aww. So she had a little delayed response to it, So on the one hand, I felt terrible for her. On the other hand, I felt great.
Yeah. Well, you really captured the 2 worlds so well that when I would switch from the Korea sections and all of a sudden they'd be eating Good and Plenty candy or playing with, I don't remember if Barbie makes an appearance, but playing with Western toys, it was really kind of jarring. But you both described the immigrant experience incredibly well, both from the point of view of young girls and complicated relationships with their mothers. I wonder if you want to talk about that a little bit, or read a passage about that.
No, I'll do a quick reading of that deals with that, with the parent piece especially, and then just say one word. Not one word literally, but you know. Sorry. Okay, so this is from the middle of the book, from day 3 of the trial. Yeah, day 3 of the trial. And there are 4 days. And this is from a chapter. Each chapter in my novel is a different character, and there are 7 POV character voices. And this one is from Pak, who is the father of the immigrant family. Pak Yu was a different person in English than in Korean. In a way, he supposed, it was inevitable for immigrants to become child versions of themselves, stripped of their verbal fluency, and with it, a layer of their competence and maturity. Before moving to America, he'd prepared himself for the difficulties he knew he'd experience: the logistical awkwardness of translating his thoughts before speaking, the intellectual taxation of figuring out words from context, the physical challenge of shaping his tongue into unfamiliar positions to make sounds that didn't exist in Korean. But what he hadn't known, hadn't expected, was that this linguistic uncertainty would extend beyond speech and, like a virus, infect other parts: his thinking, demeanor, his very personality itself. In Korean, he was an authoritative man, educated and worthy of respect. In English, he was a deaf, mute idiot, unsure, nervous, and inept. A pabo. That was the thing he regretted most about their move to America: the shame of becoming less proficient, less adult than his own child. He'd expected this to happen eventually, had seen how children and parents switch places as the parents age, their minds and bodies reverting to childhood, then infancy, then non-being. But not for many years, and certainly not yet, when Mary still had a foot in childhood. In Korea, he had been the teacher. But after his move, when he visited Mary's school, her principal had said, "Welcome. Tell me, how are you liking Baltimore?" Pak smiled, nodded, and was deciding how to answer. Perhaps the smile nod had been enough, when Mary said, "He loves it here, running the store right by Inner Harbor. Right, Dad?" The rest of the meeting, Mary continued speaking for him, answering questions directed his way, like a mother with her 2-year-old son. So, thanks. So, I think that as an 11-year-old, I came over, and one of the big things for me to adjust to in immigration that sort of set me thinking about sort of relativity, happiness, and all sorts of things is just the fact that in Korea we were so poor, and we lived in one room, all 3 of us, in a house that had no indoor plumbing. And then so in some ways, coming to the U.S. was like a dream come true, because we were all of a sudden in this suburban house by Towson, Maryland, with multiple indoor bathrooms and beds for everybody, and individual separate bedrooms for everyone, and TVs and things like that, and microwaves. And so in that sense, I knew that I should feel very lucky. And yet at the same time, in Korea, we had been together, the 3 of us, and we were very close, and we were in one room. And then here, my parents ran a grocery store in downtown Baltimore in a very dangerous neighborhood. They worked from 6 to midnight. And so I never saw them, and I lived with my aunt and uncle. And so the separation, I think, is something that is definitely common to our books. And so it was a very painful time, and I rebelled and all sorts of things. And I think one of the pains is seeing your parents and how they become sort of lesser versions who lose their confidence, and how I felt the same way, not speaking the language. And I don't think that we understand as much in this society how integral language is to us and to our perceived intelligence. And I think that's one of the reasons why autism is so interesting to me, especially nonverbal autism, and why I chose to really focus on that here. Because I do think that that's something that when you don't speak and when you have a communication deficit, how that just infects every single part of how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you. So that was one huge takeaway from me.
And Eugenia, you write about the experience of, is it Miran? Is that how you say her
Miran,
name? Like
yes.
it's very affecting the way she's taunted at school. And you want to talk about that or read a passage?
The book is, every other chapter alternates between Inja's experience and Miran's experience here in Tacoma Park. She, because it's 1950s, she's fourth grade, so it's mid-1950s, when the law had not yet changed to allow Asians to immigrate to the U.S. So she was one of 2 Asian families in all of Montgomery County at that time, which is impossible to believe right now, right? But back then, that's how it was. So she experienced racism. People would call her, all kinds of names and make fun of her language, even though she spoke perfect English. But the thing that really struck me about my parents as immigrants is something that I only discovered after I got married to a very American guy who had grown up, in a very American way. And he would use colloquialisms that I had never heard of before. Things like Katie barred the door, So there's a list. So my character collects these colloquialisms. And one time during Thanksgiving, a woman came over. They have an American friend. And she came over and she gave her this entire list of these animal colloquialisms. One of them is, don't have a cow. These are so simple, but it's like when you don't understand what they are. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone, blind as a bat, busy as a beaver, mad as a wet hen. There's more than one way to skin a cat. I mean, can you imagine that? Yeah. The dog eat dog whirl and the dog and pony show. So.
And then we'll talk for a minute or two about craft, and then I think we'll open it up for questions. But I was talking to Angie before the event, and I was really surprised to learn that you are among those of us who don't know what you're doing when you set out to write, because her book, when you read it, you need to buy both of these books afterwards. It's just so well crafted and such a kind of, she parcels out the information in such sort of discreet and what seemed considered ways. So I thought only a lawyer could do that, but apparently you just kind of stumbled through it like the rest of us. Can you talk about how you went about writing?
Yeah, sure. We were just talking about plotting, and I was saying I'm more of a pantser, for those of you who know what that means, than a plotter, because I really like to have an outline, and I tried to have like a short 1-page outline, but I wouldn't stick to it, so I don't know what good it did me, because I would write like 2 or 3 chapters, and then I'd be like, okay, well, I have to just throw that away and then redo the outline. So it was an iterative process for sure, and I didn't know who actually did what or why or how until I actually got to the end myself. And which is and then there was a lot of revision and sort of setting up the red herrings and all that kind of stuff, all the fun stuff that you do for murder mysteries that I did afterwards. But really, when I was writing through it, it was really sort of sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, bird by bird, right? And I love that image of, I forget who said it, which famous writer, who said, it's sort of like writing a novel is sort of like having a really long drive in the middle of the night in a storm, and all you have to worry about is just going to where the headlights show you, or something like, I'm bungling the quote, but something like that.
Yale doctoral.
Yeah. And I love that, because that's exactly how I wrote, and it wasn't until I was actually done drafting that I was like, okay, now I can go back and do the heavy work of like outlining what I've already written and trying to figure out how to fit all this together.
Well, for someone who didn't know what she was doing, Angie's book is amazing. She just got an Oprah nod as well, so yeah. Amongst other major accolades. This was my second novel, so I knew that to not know what you're doing is okay.
Yeah.
And I also had the guidance of my family stories to lead me along the way. But like I tell my students, the thing you want to focus on in writing a literary novel is character. If you just stay with the character and stay with who they are and what they believe in, what they experience, whatever situation that they are, how they would react, then that's from that story will automatically rise. So.
And did you know from the start that you would tell it through the lens of the two girls alternating?
No, I actually had 4 major characters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so it got cut down to 2.
Wait, did your agent or your editor tell you to cut it down, or did you make that decision?
We submitted it to my editor once, and she rejected it, and that's when I cut 2 characters. Yeah.
Wow.
So I knew something was wrong with the novel, and I started over from scratch.
Okay.
So I just basically, put the pages away and started over from scratch.
That's so funny because I started out with 4 POV characters too. And then my agent, when I submitted to my agent and she, I became her client, it had 4 POV characters. And she had me add like 2 more. And then we sold it. And then my editor had me add even 1 more. So we ended up with 7. So I was like, I don't know what happened. Yeah.
Yours is a mystery. That's why.
Funny, yeah.
Which one was added at the end?
I'm not going to say because
Okay.
it might be a spoiler. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Can I also ask you about the title, Angie?
Oh, yes. You can ask me about the title. Okay, so she's asking about the title because for the longest time, it used to be called Miracle Submarine. And in fact, if you have an advanced reader copy, it says Miracle Submarine on it. We printed like 10,000 copies and sent them to everyone with Miracle Submarine as the title, which is the HBOT chamber. And then we got feedback from one particular person, but then it was echoed through a lot of different people that Submarine, having the submarine in the title, made it seem like either a military thriller
Right.
or a children's novel because of the yellow submarine.
Right.
And so just nobody was happy with it. And my agent had already she'd always hated it. So she was like, yay, nobody likes it. We have to change it. And the rest of us were like, ah. And so we sent out these, in fact, I have it. We sent out these stickers to put on. And so they're like these stickers that say like Miracle Creek, Angie Kim, to put on the spine of the ark and things like that. So it's really funny to think about. But it's interesting that it was mostly booksellers who had that. And so it's interesting that booksellers and also some book reviewers, that they have that much, sort of power in the process.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Yeah.
Good.
Well, this is a good time to open it up to your questions. And I've been told, please raise your hand and the microphone will find its way to you.
Eugenia, you mentioned English language expressions. What about Korean language expressions, and how do you use Korean language, both of you?
So I wanted to do the same thing for the Korean language, but it not being my language, I had to. Luckily, I knew a woman who, in the early '60s, wrote a book called The Wisdom of the Dragon, and it's all Korean proverbs. So that was very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
I want a copy of that.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Yeah. And it's, for me, I do have some Korean phrases and stuff like that in here. And one thing that's sort of interesting is this whole thing of like italicizing foreign words and, versus not. I don't know. What did you do? Did you italicize
We
Korean?
italicized the first time it appeared, and then
Okay.
after that, not.
Yeah, I think that's the standard way to go.
Yeah.
And I, of course, fought the standard way to go because I don't really like any of the standard ways. So I'm a very difficult person, I guess. And so I said, these Korean phrases are coming from people for whom it's not foreign.
Right.
Like, so when a Korean person says 기러기 아빠, and that means wild goose father, like, the 기러기 아빠, which is spelled out in English, like phonetically, I said, that's not foreign to the person whose POV chapter that is. So I'd really like to keep that plain font and then italicize Wild Goose Father, which is the one that's the translated version that they're explaining. So I actually, so we had a lot of copy editing sort of debates back and forth, but I managed to sort of win that one, so I was happy.
Can you explain that phrase? Because that really struck me. I hadn't heard that before.
The Kirogi Oppa, it means wild goose father. It's a huge phenomenon in Korea right now, and has been for like the last decade. So in Korea, the education system is so difficult and harsh, with the high school students having to take an entrance exam for college, and there being high suicide rates and things like that. So a lot of times what especially affluent families will do is they will send one parent, usually the mother, and the children abroad to, Australia, New Zealand, but mostly the U.S. And there's a whole contingent in Northern Virginia, and they are trying to go to TJ and all this stuff. And so they come over, and they, are working through an education visa, and then the father stays home in Seoul to try to, make money to continue to work. And the reason why they're called wild goose fathers is because they, migrate once a year, fly once a year to see their children, and then come back. And then there's this whole new vernacular that's grown up around it, like penguin father. So if you're like a poor family and the father can't even travel even once a year, then they're called penguin fathers, because they don't fly or whatever. And so it's this huge thing that's arisen, and it's, I think, big here in the DC area and in the LA area and things like that.
Question over here.
Oh.
I think he's on his way.
He's coming. Oh, he's kind of coming.
Hi, this is for Angie. Moms deal with guilt universally. Moms with kids with special needs, which is more and more moms now,
Absolutely.
deal with guilt in this book, and I'd just like you to talk to that.
Talk about that?
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
So, yeah, I do think there's a lot about sort of guilt around, and the shame of thinking things that you're not supposed to. I think there is this myth of the good mother, capital G, capital M, in the society, and there's this almost like mothers need to be saintly all the time, and mothers need to sort of enjoy every single aspect of being a mother, every single moment of every single day, and you're not allowed to sort of think bad things. Or at least that's what I've sort of experienced and sort of resented about being a mother who loves my children, but at the same time it's difficult, especially when they are dealing with illnesses, but even if they're not, it's just a difficult thing, and there are definitely times when you just want to, and you think things that you really can't say out loud. And I think in this society, you're allowed to sort of think and say things against your parents. Kids do it all the time. People do it against their spouses all the time, and it's like that's the stuff of like that's what half the sitcoms are all about. But you can't do it against your children. You just can't, because mothers are supposed to be saintly. So I think that's one of the things that I really tried to tackle. I'm not sure that I tried, like I didn't set out to have that message or anything. But I think when I sort of was writing the scenes, it just sort of came out that these are the kinds of things that these women, these mothers especially, were talking about, and they were saying things that shamed them to each other, and being really close and intimate with each other, and trying to be honest and supporting each other through those times. So I hope that I've done that a little bit, and I've heard from people that it has helped them feel like they're not the only ones that have these fleeting thoughts from time to time, and help them to feel like they're not monsters for having that. So I hope that that's true.
Guilt is actually at the center of your book as well, Eugenia, the mother.
Yeah, because she has abandoned her child. So how do you live with that?
Yeah.
In actuality, they lost touch with the family in Korea during the war for 6 months. So, she had no idea whether she was dead or alive. So, yeah, she struggles with guilt a lot. But I wanted to say something about Angie's book. So I have a child with disabilities, and I often read books and see movies that treat children with disabilities as if they have some kind of magical powers.
Yes.
And that's one thing that I really admired about her book. It was very realistic. A child with autism didn't speak, but not because he had something more profound to say. It's just that he didn't speak. So it's one of the things that I thought was really rare in her book. That portrayal of people with disabilities was amazing.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes. Wait, here comes the microphone.
How successful were those treatments, and is that feeling of there's hope, like that the parents get as part of the book, or?
So, in the book, obviously, it didn't work very well because there was an explosion and people died. Okay, I really shouldn't laugh about that. Sorry. It just, as I was saying it just seemed really ironic to me. Sorry. In real life, so my son, his ulcerative colitis did heal by the end of the treatments, but I caution you, like, it's not FDA approved. We have no idea. I was doing so many different treatments at that time, including like going gluten-free for celiac disease, which we discovered. So it could be that it needed, that the being gluten-free for 3 months was what it took for the swelling and inflammation and all that kind of stuff to die down. So I just want to sort of say, disclaimer, it is an experimental treatment, it's not. But the one thing that I will say, which is one of the things that made me name this Miracle Submarine, is that at the end of the summer, I think I mentioned the same child was born deaf in one ear. And it's a neuropathy, auditory neuropathy. And we were worried about the effect of the pressurization, the constant daily pressurization on his ear. So we did like hearing tests at the end of that, towards the end. And the audiologist, I still remember, like, just looked at me and said, "There's something wrong." And I thought, oh no, it's gonna be that, we messed up his one good ear. And it turned out that he actually had hearing restored partially to the previously deaf ear. And so I told everybody about that in the HBOT chamber that night, and they said, "Oh, it's a miracle." And I said, "Well, it's not really a huge miracle because it was only partially restored, but still, they were like, oh, okay, then it's a little miracle." And so we called it, the blue submarine of little miracles for a time. And then while I was but it was confusing because it's not supposed to be anything for hearing. But then when I was 10 years later, I was doing research for this novel on HBOT and seeing what had happened since we did it. It turns out that there are FDA clinical trials going on right now for sudden deafness for HBOT. That's one of the promising new therapies. So I do think that it was. And then when I told my son's ENT about it at my launch party a month ago, he said, "Oh yeah, I submitted your son's the data and the anecdotal evidence for some study at Johns Hopkins or whatever." So in some small way, I think it may have been part of the origin of that. So I think it's really cool.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah.
Well, thank you both, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you.